In chapter 30, we're going to be learning perfect participles. There's a few other things in the chapter, like genitive absolutes and periphrastic constructions, but most of the chapter is about the perfect or the completed participle. And one of the things that's really nice is that this is the last chapter on participles, all right? So once you've learned this chapter, you've learned all you're going to need to know for first year Greek on perfect participles. So congratulations. Let me just, in a very general sense, give you an overview of the formation and the meaning of the perfect participle. In terms of the formation of the perfect participle, it's formed, as you would expect, on the perfect tense stem. But I need to point out something about vocalic reduplication. You remember back when you were learning reduplication, I said that if the perfect tense stem starts with a vowel, the reduplication is a lengthening of that vowel, and then it looks just like an augment, but it's not the augment, and you have to keep them separate. Okay, this is why I said that. Think of the word like agapao. When agapao goes into the aorist, the alpha lengthens to an eta. So if you have an aorist participle, that eta unaugments back up to an alpha, right? Okay, but when you get to the perfect, the alpha has undergone vocalic reduplication. The alpha's gone to an eta. But when you go into the participle, the eta stays. It does not unaugment because it's not an augment. It's vocalic reduplication, okay? The augment indicates past time, so you have to get rid of it in an aorist participle. But the vocalic reduplication in the perfect indicates completed action, and so it stays, okay? So in terms of formation, the perfect participle is formed off of the perfect tense stem, and it maintains the vocalic reduplication, as well as the consonantal reduplication. There are a few second perfects in Greek, but there's not many of them, let's just say in Biblical Greek. And I've stuck them in the advanced information section. So the forms that I'm going to be showing you in this chapter are all first perfects, okay? Okay. What about the meaning of a perfect participle? Well, as you would expect from the indicative, the perfect participle indicates a completed action with ongoing consequences into the present of the speaker. That's the same significance in the participles. They indicate a completed action, and therefore they're going to be in the past. But that's not the primary significance. The primary significance is that the action's completed and that it has present consequences. So the question is, how do you bring that into English? And my suggestion kind of is a default translation, kind of like with just ing with the other participles. I think the default translation is whenever you see a perfect participle, just translate after, having, and then the past participle form of the English verb, the third principal part of the English verb. So it would be after having eaten, if it were, for example, the perfect participle of estheo. So after having and the third principal part. That's just kind of a default translation, and it works in most situations, okay? All right. Well, let's get into the specifics of how you form the perfect participle. The first perfect or completed active participle is formed with reduplication, the perfect active tense stem, a tense formative, which is kappa, come back to that in a second, the participle morpheme, which is omicron tau, come back to that in a second too, and then case endings. And so you get a form like lelucatis. So if you saw lelucatis, you would see the lambda epsilon. Okay, it's a perfect form. It's from luo. The kappa would tell you it's in the perfect, and the ot you would remember as the alternate active participle morpheme along with nu tau. All right? So what's going on with these two variations, tense formative and participle morpheme? This is a real technical discussion. If you want to read more about it, pick up my morphology. But this is a slightly simplified answer, but it works for teaching in first year, so that's why I do it this way. Just memorize that the kappa alpha, the normal tense formative for the perfect, simplifies, and you have a kappa. And on the participle morpheme, omicron tau is just the active participle morpheme. Some people think of the omicron as a connecting vowel, but for various reasons, I think omicron tau is the participle morpheme. The omicron tau shouldn't, though, give you a lot of trouble, because when you have nu tau, you have omicron nu tau. So you just drop out the nu, and it's no big deal. But anyway, that's how you form the perfect, the first perfect active participle. You go into the paradigm, and you can see lelucos, leluquia, lelucas, and then it gets very regular, as you would expect. Lelucatas, leluquias, lelucatus. You can see what's happening, I'm sure. In the masculine and the nominative singular, the tau dropped out because of the sigma, the omicron lengthened to an omega, but after that, it's exactly what you'd expect. Dative plural, the tau drops off too. In the neuter, the tau dropped out because of the sigma, but the omicron didn't do anything, perfectly regular from there. And since these are third declension endings, and since the feminine has to be first declension, you have the normal significant shift, and kos goes to quia, but after that is perfectly regular. So the 6 forms you need to learn are kos, quia, kas, katas, quias, katas. You move into the middle passive, and it's reduplication plus the perfect middle passive tense stem, the participle morpheme, which is the one we've learned all along, it's men, and then case endings, and you get lelumenoi. Again, you see that the participle is pushed right up against the tense stem, but you're used to that in the perfect middle passive. No big deal, right? The paradigm is almost not worth showing you because it's so regular. It shouldn't give you any problems at all. Well, if it is giving you problems, then you are in trouble. But I'm sure by now you guys are doing fine. And the 6 forms you have to learn are menas, and after that they're perfectly regular. Mene, menon, menu, menes, menu. Okay, well that's it for the perfect participle, and that's it for participles as a whole, okay? But there's a few other little oddities connected with the participle that we need to cover in the chapter. The first is what's called a genitive absolute. Now, an absolute construction in any language is a construction that is unrelated grammatically to the rest of the sentence. In other words, the absolute means it's not connected, it's just kind of hanging there. When you come to Greek, the genitive absolute is defined this way. You have a noun or pronoun in a genitive, and then you have a participle in the genitive, and these two words are not grammatically connected to the rest of the sentence. Now, I probably should mention that you can have some genitive absolutes without the noun or pronoun, but most genitive absolutes have a noun or pronoun. So a genitive absolute is when you have a noun or a pronoun and a participle, both in the genitive, and they are grammatically disconnected from the rest of the sentence. And one of the odd things that's going on in this construction is that the noun or pronoun in the genitive is functioning as if it were the subject of the participle. Now, participles technically can't have subjects, but the noun or pronoun in the genitive is functioning as if it were, okay? So that's the basic definition of what a genitive absolute is. Let's look at a couple of examples, and you'll see them in context. Well, the first is, and immediately, and let's ignore the eti for a second. And immediately, and then you would be translating this, of him speaking. Well, that doesn't make any sense. But then it continues, Judas arrives. Well, you can see that the basic sentence is, and immediately Judas arrives. And then you have this eti autou laluntas. Now, if you don't recognize this as a genitive absolute, it can be really frustrating. And actually, that's one of the main clues of a genitive absolute. You're translating along, and you hit this noun or pronoun in the genitive, and then you got a participle in the genitive, and it just doesn't make sense. All right. Well, the clue is it's a genitive. Okay. And so when you see that, oh, this is probably a genitive absolute. So what you do in this sentence is that you would translate it, and immediately the autus, the noun or pronoun of the genitive, functioning as if it were the subject of the participle, and immediately he speaking. Okay, most of the participles in genitive absolutes are temporal, and so you can add while or after. And so you would say, and immediately while he is speaking, and then the eti is just a little adverb, and immediately while he is still speaking, Judas comes. Okay, did you follow that? So what you do is that you hit the noun or pronoun in the genitive and then the participle. Perhaps it doesn't make sense at first, and you realize, oh, they're genitives. Okay, this is a genitive absolute. Most genitive absolutes are temporal, so you can use while if it's present and after if it's an aorist, but most of them are presents. And then you translate the noun or pronoun in the genitive as if it were the subject, okay? So, and immediately, while he is still speaking, Judas arrives. All right, let's look at the second example. These things he speaking. Doesn't make any sense, does it? But if you go to the rest of the sentence, it's easy. Many believed in him. Okay, so the basic sentence is many believed in him. But this tauta autu laluntis, you go, that didn't make any sense. Oh, these are genitive. Okay, this is a genitive absolute. What's tauta? Well, you might think initially it's nominative, but it can't be nominative because there's nothing for it to modify, and the subject is poloi. So tauta has to be an accusative. It, in fact, is the direct object of laluntas. Welcome to Greek, right? Yeah, sometimes you can have direct objects before verbs. It's okay. But you have the genitive absolute, which is autu laluntis. So it is, while, and then autu, he, laluntis, was speaking tauta these things, many believed in him. As you can see with genitive absolutes, it's kind of like participles are on steroids. Some participles you have to really think grammatically and see all the linkages and then say, okay, how do I say that in English? When it comes to genitive absolutes, you really have to do that. There's no way to translate a genitive absolute word for word. So you identify that it is a genitive absolute, and then you see where all the pieces fit grammatically, and then you say, okay, how do I say this in English? Okay, as long as you recognize it's the genitive absolute, they're pretty straightforward. It shouldn't cause you a ton of problems anyway. Okay, let me give you just a couple of clues, and I've mentioned some of them already, but let me kind of pull them all together in one place for identifying genitive absolutes. First of all, the participle is always going to be an arthrous. They're always adverbial participles, and most of them are temporal. So that's just why you can have the while and the after. The majority of genitive absolutes are use present tense verbs, present tense participles. So again, that should jump out a bit at you. One of the nice things, too, about genitive absolutes is they tend to occur at the beginning of a sentence in narrative. You don't tend to find genitive absolutes in Paul, for example, in theological discussion, but it is part of the storytelling methods of Greek. That's where you tend to find the genitive absolutes. So you're going to be reading a narrative, and it's going to be the beginning of the sentence. It's probably going to be a present participle. Most certainly it's going to be an adverbial present participle, okay? And then you use while or after and translate the noun or pronoun, the genitive, as the subject of the participle. There is one other clue in the textbook, and that is a lot of genitive absolutes, I just sat down and counted them up to find this, is that they will use autu, a form of he, and then the participle will be a form of lego or laleo. And so you can see why that would happen. While he is speaking, or while he was saying these things, then this happened. So that often is what you're going to find in genitive absolutes. There's also quite a few genitive absolutes in the New Testament using ginomai. But those are the clues that you're hitting a participle. But the main clue is that you're reading along and you hit this genitive and it doesn't make any sense. And it's just got to click. Oh, it's genitive. It's a genitive. It could be a genitive absolute. Okay? All right. So much for genitive absolutes. The other odds and end I wanted to share with you relative to participles is something called periphrastic constructions. In English, we use helping verbs. Okay? That's how we sometimes form our different tenses. And Greek doesn't do that for the most part. But there is one place in which there are helping verbs. They're called periphrastic constructions. Periphrasis just means a roundabout way of saying something. And a periphrastic construction is, instead of just using a simple verb, you use a form of a me, and then you take that verb and put it into a participial form. And the periphrastic way of stating it is to have a me plus the participle of the verb. Originally, the periphrastic construction was an emphasis on the linear or the ongoing continuous nature of the verb. Now, there are other ways to emphasize that, like use an imperfect, but if the Greeks wanted to really emphasize the continuous nature of an action, they would use a periphrastic construction. It's really been slipping in Greek usage, and then you will find periphrastic constructions where there's no emphasis on the linear aspect beyond just the meaning of the verb or something like that. So just because it's periphrastic in the Bible doesn't mean you can really, preach the linear aspect of the form. In fact, in the third person plural, perfect middle passive, Greeks use periphrastics instead of the regular simple form of the verb. It's just something that language is always changing. That's what was going on. So, and the thing about Greek periphrastic constructions is that we translate them very easily in English. In fact, you'll probably even translate and not know that's what you're doing. But for example, there's a chart in the book, and I'm not going to spend the time now to go through them, so make sure you look at them. But for example, there's a periphrastic imperfect. Okay, in other words, the imperfect is already continuous, but if you really wanted to push and to emphasize the continuous nature of the verb, you would use the imperfect form of a me, and then you would use the present form of the participle. So if the verb is to sit, you would say, like, to say they were sitting, it's eison kathemenoi. That's one of the examples in the workbook. You'll see it. So the periphrastic construction is just the use of a me plus the participial form of the verb. They are, I am, and the verb. It'll be easy for you to translate. The only thing that perhaps is a little tricky is that sometimes you can put words between a me and the participle. And what will happen is that you'll translate a me, and then you'll be reading along, and all of a sudden you can hit a participle, and you go, well, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't fit. And, it connects with the a me, and it's a periphrastic construction. Okay? All right. There's one other thing that I wanted to share, and that is something about adverbial participles. I've already given you several special ways to translate adverbials. Some adverbial participles are temporal, right? And so if it's present, we use when or while. If it's an aorist, we can use after. I also said that some adverbial participles are causal. And in other words, they're showing the cause of something, and so you can use because in front of the participle. Well, there are other special uses of adverbial participles. In fact, there's a lot. You'll be meeting a lot of these in second-year Greek, and you should take second-year Greek. But there's three that I want to introduce to you in this textbook because they're in the workbook for this chapter. Some adverbial participles are classified as instrumental. In other words, you can use the keyword by, but the participle is the instrument or the means by which an action is done. So Paul will say, we toil working with our hands. Well, we toil. How? What's the instrument of our toil? Well, it's by working with our hands. Okay? So that's the instrumental participle. There's also a concessive participle, and the key phrase for this is even though. In other words, you'll be reading along and you'll say, having eyes you do not see. Okay, it kind of makes sense, but make it proper English. Well, even though you have eyes, you do not see. Okay, so there's instrumental, there's concessive, and then for lack of a better phrase, some participles are just translated as regular verbs. And the main example of that is a kind of a strange idiom where the Greek will say, answering, he said. And most people feel that you can just say, he answered and said, or in a lot of modern translations, they just drop the participle out completely because it's such horrid English and just say, he answered. Okay, so in that situation where you have a participle and another regular verb, sometimes you're going to translate the participle as a regular verb as well, usually in that kind of construction. Okay, all right. Well, so much for participles. Let's go to the summary and remind ourselves what we have learned. A participle is a verbal adjective, an ing word. Because it's a verbal adjective, it can function adverbially. In this case, it agrees with the word that is doing the participle, the action of the participle, in case, number, and gender, but the thrust of the meaning of the participle is directed towards the verb. Adverbial participles are often functioning as temporal clauses, which is why we have while or after, but you can also use the keywords because, by, through, or translate it as a finite verb. But participles are also verbal adjectives. And just like any adjective, they can function either as an attributive or substantively. An attributive participle will agree with the word it is modifying in case, number, and gender, and it's usually articular. The case of a substantival participle will be determined by its function in the sentence, its gender and number by what it is referring back to. It too will be usually articular, and you will generally have to add in words to translate it. Participles do not indicate absolute time. They only indicate relative time. The present participle indicating an action occurring at the same time as the main verb, and the aorist participle indicated an action that happened prior to the time of the main verb. To that we could add the completed or the perfect participle, indicating a completed action with consequences felt in the present of the speaker. The participle morpheme chart is now complete. Nu tau is used as an active and as an aorist passive morpheme. Omicron tau is used in the perfect active, and men with the appropriate vowel is used for all middle participles and all middle passive participles. The master participle chart is also complete, and you need to be able to repeat it, and especially the 6 memory forms. The present active uses on, usa, on, antas, use, santas. Present middle passive, amanas, and from there you can figure it out. First aorist, sas, sasa, san, santas, sase, santas. First aorist middle is samanas. First aorist passive, thes, thesa, then, thentas, theses, thentas. The second aorist in the active in the middle is the same as in the present. And then the second aorist passive, the 6 forms are ace, asa, en, entas, aces, entas. In the perfect active, the 6 forms are kos, quia, kas, katas, quias, katas. And in the perfect middle passive, it's menas, and you can figure it out from there. Congratulations. Mede. But not, nor, not even. Presbyteros, presbytera, presbyteron. Elder, older.